welcome back to an Automation Ladies episode. We are recording here on a Wednesday in our remote studio, and our guest today is somebody that Allie brought on. Allie, why don't you introduce our guest, or why you invited him to come on the show?
I, delved into creating technical content, and I still have a lot of aspirations to do that, but my passion has started with process engineering because I'm a chemical engineer. So I study chemical engineering. And that got me to, at the beginning of my career, kind of fall in love with different types of equipment, like unit ops. And definitely, boilers was in that category of like utility equipment that we had to learn about. We had to learn how to size. And I have in my life bought or spec'd out, different size boilers and then, used steam to do various things in the process side of things because it's a huge utility in a ton of process industries. And so I saw Eric was, teaching people because I'm also a burner technician. So like NFPA 86 is furnaces and NFPA 85 is boilers. So like the way that we like run the burner controls is similar. They just have high pressure considerations. So to me, it's like super exciting just to talk to somebody who has, put their hands on the NFPA 85 side. So all the stuff that's used to run and do the controls and even just like the equipment itself. And then there's just a lot of piping considerations. So in a lot of cases, you may need to heat stuff and you'll use low pressure steam or high pressure steam, but you need a boiler to make the steam. And so there's a lot of places that use this. But anyway, I found his content and I just wanted to hear his story because I think people know how to work on stuff and nobody wants to talk about it the way that he's doing it so that other people can learn and even get excited and be like, oh, I could be a boiler technician. So I think it depends on what you know and what your background is. Like it could be boring. To me, it's like super cool because I really like that equipment.
Well, I'm pretty interested, even though I've never worked around boilers or had any interest in the past. But now that I know that they're there, just like everything else, I'm like, oh, tell me all the things. So yeah. Johnson, welcome to Automation Ladies. Thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. This is my first podcast, so I'm excited.
No kidding. Oh, well, what a cool milestone. Thank you so much for letting us be your first podcast. Don't take this as any kind of bar for what podcasting is like. We don't know what we're doing, but
we're setting the bar high.
We like to have the conversations. So our first standard question is if you could just give us a little intro of yourself and what's your story of how you got here to be making content for boilers and, the stuff that you're doing today.
So my grandfather actually started a boiler service company and my dad is in the business. So I've always been around boilers and I grew up around boilers and service, and I'm very mechanically inclined and just like taking apart, maybe a four-wheeler or working on something in your garage, working on your car. That's always interests me and how stuff is made and how stuff is manufactured. And a lot of that goes into the focus with boilers. And what I found was it's just an outlet for mechanical things. I really like bulldozers and big yellow equipment.
Like welding.
Since I've grown up around boilers, it's just the avenue that I chose. So after high school, I wasn't super into college, but I was looking at construction management. But I found a HVAC engineering technology program, Fair State, Go Bulldogs. It's up in Michigan, and essentially the first 2 years is teaching you how to be a HVAC technician at a very high level, as much as you can in 2 years. I mean, they have labs, probably one of the most in-depth labs I've seen. A lot of industry sponsors and whatnot. So it's really great experience. And then the next 2 years, which is a bachelor's degree, is designing. So essentially my senior project, my last semester was like spec design a mechanical system for a museum in the middle of Pennsylvania. So you got to pick out all the air handlers, size all the piping, size the chillers, size all the duct. And so coming out of college, I had a pretty good idea of mechanical equipment and building environment. That's what they call it. So if you walk into a building and you don't realize the temperature, some engineer has done a very good job because you are comfortable without you knowing being comfortable. Anytime you walk into a building and you go, hey, it's cold, then something is off in the controls and it's probably not to the greatest design or it's not operating correctly. So after college, I looked at construction management and whatnot, and I really just didn't want to be in a job site trailer and just sitting around. And I really wanted to do some hands-on stuff and get field experience. So I ended up working for a boiler service company, being a service technician with a bachelor's degree. But, a lot of people say, oh, college is a waste of time and whatnot. And it is if you go for the wrong degree or you're just showing up to show up. I used a lot of my college experience because there was a lot of controls classes, PID loops, and all that stuff, logic that I used day one out in the field. That if I hadn't gone to college, I would be walking into a mechanical room, not knowing what anything is, not knowing what an air handler is or a chiller and how they work. And that would set me back. So while I don't work on chillers or air handlers, it is something that you should know about because every building or process has connected components. And while you may only be working on one component, which in my case is a boiler, all the other components work together like heat exchangers. So that's something I learned about. And humidity and how to use steam for humidity in hospitals and all this stuff. And so it goes beyond, I think people get very narrow focused on, well, I just need to learn boilers. Why would I learn anything else? And like life isn't binary and you can't learn one avenue of material and just avoid everything else because everything is connected, and even more so in building controls. So I was a service tech, slinging wrenches, doing on call, just working like 2,800 to 3,000 hours a year. I loved it and just learning so much, go home, read manuals at night, and you just try to show up and be the best person for the customer because you realize like, my company's billing me out at 120 an hour or whatever. And you want to show up and represent that 120 an hour. If you show up unprepared, I felt so bad. And while I always tell people to be the expert, you just have to know one more thing than the customer. And that's a lot of what I did is read the manual, memorize what I need to know, walk in, have the right answers for 2 or 3 questions from the customer, and then figure it out. And at the end of the day, as long as the problem is fixed correctly, it doesn't matter how much you know or don't know about the problem. And so I did that. And then probably year 4, year 5 of being a service technician, I had learned enough. I had probably reached the point of like I was competent and got into a groove of and knew what I was doing. And a lot of people were like, oh, how can you do that in 3 or 4 years? Well, when you only work on boilers and burners and that's it.
Oh, you can.
Yeah. And then like your life is consumed by it. You go home, you read stuff at night and all this stuff. You would be amazed at what you can know in 3 and 4 years, especially if you start working on the same equipment, same job sites, and then you learn how every mechanical room starts to work. So, I would start trying to teach people, and obviously companies trying to hire people to, be service techs. And it's definitely a difficult job and it takes a special kind of person. And I found that there's a lot of people that just want to show up and just be kind of told what to do. And a service tech is something like you have to be a self-starter and be somebody.
Initiative yourself.
Yeah, initiative and be somebody who's going to fix a problem because you're normally not working with anybody else. The customer's not standing over you. And if you go, I'll just leave this for somebody else or, nobody will know, it will come back and bite you, whether it's a callback or the problem doesn't get fixed correctly or whatnot. So I'm trying to teach that and instill that in other people, as long with the technical stuff. And, all the new people or people that the company was hiring, it comes down like, oh, where can I learn stuff and all this? I'm like, well, it's in the manual and all this stuff, and you show them. And it just never seemed to be too much of structure of learning. And
I think some people can read a manual and learn, but a lot of people have different learning styles where like the reading the manual isn't going to do it for them.
Yes. So reading a manual, you have to be able to visualize what you're reading. And especially if you've never seen what you are reading about, is very difficult. But
Yeah.
I was like, so I'm looking around the industry, and as we probably all know, the blue collar industry, tons of baby boomers are retiring. There's tons of need in the industry for people, especially people that know something. And all the companies that are having boiler training or burner training, they seem to be running the same playbook over and over again. And while like they do great training and whatnot, the outcome of their training isn't affected by the service technician. So whether the service tech learns or not, they still get paid, and then the service tech goes home, and there's a disconnect between training that the company is training the service tech on and what the service tech actually needs to know. And it ends up being a one size fits all approach. So I looked at other industries, and I think the HVAC industry is a leading indicator of boilers. Boilers are just really a niche of HVAC, and HVAC has a lot of online learning programs that are helping HVAC technicians and even chiller technicians to learn stuff. And with the boiler industry, there's not too many online programs that are great that I would recommend to another service technician to take. So by year 7 of being a service technician, I was like, I'm young, not married. Like, there's only one time to do this. If nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to jump in the ring and be the person who tries to make the change in the industry. Because a lot of people wait till they're like 50, 55, or, whatever, and semi-retired to try to like give back and teach, which is fine. But sometimes I realize that I have to remove myself from the customer problems of the industry to actually work on the problems of the industry and try to apply knowledge and learning programs to empower service contractors and mechanical contractors to train their own people. And so I quit my job and started Boilearn, and it's boiler and learning together. And essentially, I try to make training programs and systems for companies that actually move the needle on their service technicians and learning. So the biggest complaint I hear about like offsite training is the managers who send their people don't really know what to expect of the people that come back. So the service technician comes back, the manager asks, "Hey, like, what'd you learn?" And the service tech goes, "It was fine. I learned a couple things." But then they don't really know, like, okay, what skills,
Like, prove it out.
Yeah, what skills is this person supposed to know or don't know? And if they come back and go like, "Oh, I didn't really learn anything," now your employer, I mean, they're out probably $3,000 at least. And, what do? Do you just resend them back to the class and hope for a different outcome? So it ends up being this
balance.
Yeah, this struggle and balance of managers get very frustrated when they send people to offsite training and then they come back and they haven't really learned anything or shown initiative to learn. And a lot of times people think offsite training is, I deserve this. And if I learn something, great. If I don't, great. They're still going to pay me to be here. And with a internal training program for contractors or mechanical contractors, having a small amount of training over a long period of time is much better than an information dump of 2 or 3 days. So the biggest thing is like all these contractors, they're all experts in the industry. They're all experts on boilers, but putting that expert knowledge in a pathway that is structured and also able to be digested by somebody, because I'm not teaching anything new. Like everything I know, I could give you 15 books, but you can't buy 15 books for somebody and say, "Hey, read all this and now you know it all." But it's breaking it down just like a teacher would break down mathematics in a school, and assuming, since we are now training people who, maybe 18 years right out of high school, and they don't traditionally maybe have farm experience or mechanical experience, and I worked with a guy and I assumed he knew how to read a tape measure. So then he goes, oh, it's like,
Some people don't know lefty loosey, righty tighty.
so it's 6
Wow.
and 3 lines or whatever. I'm like, 3 lines? What are we doing? And he's like, I've never read a tape measure before. And so I taught him how to read a tape measure. So then I asked somebody else, knew that I was working with, and I'm like, hey, you know how to read a tape measure? And he's like, well, I'm not dumb. I'm like,
They're offended.
I'm like, I didn't know, because like I've worked with somebody who didn't know. Like, so it's really removing the barrier of, hey, you should know this, and get with the program on, hey, do you know this or not? And if not, we can teach you it. As long as you want to be here and you're driven, we're happy to have you, and we're happy to teach you, because that's what companies are going to need in order to survive in the future. They have to be able to develop their people in-house, and relying on outside resources it's a step in it. I wouldn't say outside resources are bad, but it is a step in a larger system and program that they need to put together. And a lot of the super big companies are starting to figure it out, because they have the money and the people to hire a full-time trainer, and build a full-time training lab and, whatnot. But
Yep.
then all the smaller companies, there's tons of service contractors out there, 30 to 50 people, that can't afford $100,000 trainer to just sit around and build stuff. So as an industry, we can collect knowledge and put together learning systems that all these contractors can just implement into their companies. And that's really why I started Boiler and what we're trying to fix. I'm self-funded. So I see people, companies come in, oh, you can train our people. Well, I can, but I don't have like a 4-year boiler degree for you, but that's what we're going towards, and we'll get there eventually.
That's really impressive. I appreciate the kind of person that sees the problem and says, well, I guess since nobody's doing it, I'll try to do it. That's the kind of people we are.
That is what you did.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the Theodore Roosevelt Man in the Ring quote, and taking initiative. And I can't complain about a problem and not try to fix it. And I tried to fix the problem, and it's impossible to fix the problem when you're working 2,800 hours a year, and also try to build training systems and whatnot. And that's when I ended up going, like, I need to remove all my customers' problems and my job problems, and only work on problems of helping the industry.
You've mentioned initiative a few times, and I think that's really important. Like, you can hire for that, but you can't really teach that. The skills you can teach if somebody has initiative. But you kind of mentioned as well that these new techs, they need to... Is that something that you found somebody can learn, to take initiative or to become a self-starter? Or is it when you work with these people,
so
they're either going to show that initiative or they're not?
It might depend on the lead. It might depend on who they watch, because people are going to mimic their leaders. So if the leaders are like what you said you need to show up and represent that $120. So many people don't give a to represent that $120. They're representing their 45 or 50 or whatever they're getting.
They're like, warm body, I'm here.
And to feel like the ownership of the work that you do, even though you're not the owner of the company, is like the highest asset workers we can even freaking have. I always felt that way, that I was representing my reputation, not just my company. I was representing me. And I want you to know that I have integrity, and you can definitely trust my company to have integrity, because they put me here because I have integrity. And like, I'm going to not hang up the phone, and I'm going to eat my dinner. I'm known for that, like eating my dinner on the phone with an electrician some other place. And like, I could have just dumped them. Like, it was 5 p.m., but I don't do that. And that's why I'm me and have what I have. But I don't know, like Nikki's saying, I don't know how you teach that. I think you just find it in people. But the only chance we have maybe is like the few of us that are already like that. You put them at the top, and then you have everyone work for them. And that's the only chance you really have, is just like put the ambitious ones in the lead. That way the other ones can see and maybe feel proud and be like, I wish I was like that guy or that girl. Because she obviously really, really, really cares about not just going home, but the job that she does. Like, yeah, we all care about our family and ourselves first, and we should, but we should care about the quality of the stuff that we do for a living. And some of us do, and some of us don't love what we do. And so we just do it for the paycheck, and it shows, and it sucks.
So part of being a service technician is how you fix a job is your signature, and you'll develop relationships with customers, and you want your signature to be when the customer when you show up, walk through the door, and they see your face, they know the problem's going to be taken care of. If they see your face and are constantly calling your company after they see your face, they get a negative view of you and go, oh, well, he's not going to, take care of the problem.
He doesn't care.
But and that's what I tried to be a rock star for my customers. And a lot of people will say like, oh, you need work-life balance and you can't work all the time and all this stuff. But with a boiler, it can be 3:00 and you have 2 more hours to go approximately. You can't really just go like, oh, well, I got to go home and I'll see you tomorrow. Like there's a manufacturing line that's down and they need it fixed, and they need it fixed now because that second shift of people are relying on you, and that third shift of people are relying on you. And the plant manager is wondering like, hey, are we going to have a boiler tonight, or do I call my 80 people on third shift and tell them that they're not working tonight? So it's a lot of responsibility and downstream of more than just like, oh, I'm just going to go home. And, I think that leads into the purpose of it. But going back to your original question, can you teach initiative? You absolutely can. Otherwise the Marine Corps wouldn't exist, and they got their slogan, the few, the proud, the Marines. And even recently, the total recruiting in the armed services is down, but the Marines still keep hitting their numbers because they try to push people to a higher purpose and be a part.
But do they accept everyone?
No.
Yeah, so you have to have some amount of initiative to even apply to the Marines in the first place.
Like IQ, like you can't be really dumb either.
And then they won't just let you in if you're just like, well, I kind of want to be a Marine because it sounds, all right. Like,
I
just as well, I could be also in the Army or in the Navy or whatever. I don't care. Like they probably wouldn't let those people in, right?
So you got to pass a test, and I'm never been in the armed services, but you got to pass a test, and then you got to pass a physical. And how you pass the test is based on essentially what you can do. And, there's plenty of people who get in the Marines that are not like you would think your typical Marine. I think it would be interesting, like, if you could quit boot camp in the Marines and just be like, this is hard, I'm done, you would probably have so many more people wash out. But they push them to get over that hurdle and believe in themselves. And so many people come from, terrible upbringing and terrible homes, and nobody has believed in them. So then they think, their world is way different than other people's worlds, and it's hard to know that. So then when an employer goes, hey, you need to take initiative, they don't even know what that is. And you have to show them that. But the first minute it gets hard, a lot of people think hard equals bad. And that's simply not true. But since there are so many blue collar service companies that are dying for people, they will just start throwing money around. So they'll find a service technician, hey, we'll give you $4 more an hour. And this person jumps ship. Oh, of course I want more money. They jump ship. And now that employer who's invested all that time trying to train them has just lost them to their competitor. And then that competitor will lose them to another competitor who pays them a little bit more. And it ends up being, you can't get somebody to commit to learning and push them hard. Because if you push them too hard of like, hey, this is going to be difficult, but we believe in your future, like in 3 years, it will be amazing. And a lot of people can't see 3 years ahead. They're worried about the end of the month, and that's about it. And they see $3 more an hour, and that gives them a little bit more money, and then they bounce. And it's not always the best career decision. While I do understand it in the short term, in the long term, chasing the money is probably not going to work out for you. Everybody's like, oh, you get huge raises and stuff. But at a certain point, you end up, especially being a service technician, you end up with a pay scale that is higher than what you can fix. Because eventually, at the end of the day, you still have to go to the job site and you have to fix stuff. So if you're getting $35-$40 an hour or whatever, and you constantly have
And you didn't fix
callbacks
it.
and whatnot, and your employer starts going like, well, what do you actually know? Like, how, like, what am I paying you for?
Ouch.
And the skills don't match the pay rate. And
Ouch.
it's just very difficult. But initiative, if you can get somebody who can see the long term and hasn't made extreme poor financial decisions before that, so that they're bootstrapped for cash and just trying to survive week by week, because they're in survival mode and they're not in career mode at that point, then you can definitely have them learn. I know of people myself, like I know a guy who was a waiter, and I know a guy who washed dishes, and they trained him to be a service technician, and he's been with the company like 24 years now. So it's absolutely possible, but it goes back to the managers have to be able to push and lead. And the problem is with that is, when you show up to work, you cost the company money. And if you keep costing them money, they can only push you so much before they just get frustrated and be like, well, this guy's never going to work out, because a lot of these smaller companies don't have endless budgets to invest 2 years of just throwing away money into you and hope that you work out. So then they just keep putting out job applications for senior service technicians with people for 5-10 years experience, because they can't get people over the hump. And that's what I'm really trying to help companies with, is get people over the hump of how do we take them from zero to kind of know what they're doing in the boiler room. And it seems like a big gap, but it's really not. But we need probably a structured training program of probably a year to 2 years to get them there. And I think if we can get people to commit, like a trade school almost, of, hey, like at 2 years, you're going to make this amount of money and you're going to know this. And that's kind of really how the union does it as well. I wasn't in the union, but they essentially say, hey, at the end of 5 years, you're going to be a journeyman and you're going to make this amount of money. And it helps people see a future, because a lot of people can't set goals for themselves, especially 5 years down the line. So essentially somebody else is telling them, hey, this is what you can have and this is what you can achieve at the end of 5 years, and they can work towards it. And a lot of employers, union or non-union, don't do that very well, even outside of just technical stuff, like, hey, how are you doing? Like, where do you want to go in your life? And, like, when you go, like, what do you want to do? And so many people go home, have no ambition to do anything. They just kind of sit around, maybe throw on Netflix, which is fine. But then, they start growing up and then they go, where did my life go? And it's very
How do you know all this? Like, do you read psychology books, or you just know about people? Like, you just know a bunch of people? And like, because you're right, that is how people work, and especially technicians. And that's a huge portion of the population is doing exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, how old are you? Or like, why do you know that?
I mean, I'm 30. I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of business and personal development. And my biggest thing from like day one has been my parents teaching me like how to work hard, and you can't get that, luck is made essentially in most of life, but how you grow up in your childhood and what you're born into is essentially the only luck that you can't control. And so many people don't have that. And I recognize that I had a great upbringing and my parents taught me hard work, and that has instilled in me the drive of always wanting to do better for myself, for other people, to help people. And I always thought everybody had that, because when you're young, you don't know. But once you get out into the real world, like, especially when I started working, like, there were so many people. I would go to plants, and there's like operators and whatnot, and they'll be probably 50s or 60s, as most of the industry is, And, they'll tell me about their wife that they got divorced from, that they hate, and their two kids that don't want to see them. And, hopefully their NFL team wins on the weekend and that they can drink beer. And I'm like,
Wow.
to
Yeah.
me, like that just sounds
You've
depressing.
talked to the people.
If I get to 50 years old and like that's what I'm talking about and that's all I have in life is just living for the weekends, and trying to instill that in other people and share that with them is also part of development of employees. And Dave Ramsey talks a lot about this, is like you can't have great employees if they're constantly worried about money, and if their parents, like if you can't reliably have people be taught money and how to manage money, you as an employer now need to take that on. And a lot of employers see that as, that's not my problem. I pay you to show up and do stuff.
It is our problem.
But
it becomes your problem whether you want it to be or not.
As an employer, you need to almost shield people from the hurt of the world and be, hey, how can we get your family life better? What are your goals? Oh, I want to buy a house one day. All right, let's work backwards. How can we get you to buy a house? And actually lay it out for them, because a lot of people haven't had that or haven't had the time to think about that. And they just think, oh, I'll never be able to buy a house. That's for those other people. And that's such a poor outlook on life. And as an employer, you shouldn't have employees that think stuff is impossible. I'm a big person of, you can always work hard and achieve, what you can. And I know a guy, I couldn't believe it at the time, but he was like, oh, I'll never own a house. That's for those other people. And, he's like, oh, I've made too many poor decisions to change my life. And he was probably 35 at that point. And
Okay.
I'm like, you're so young. Like you've maybe made poor decisions, but you can change so much in such little time. And you can't check out on life, and you can't make the change for them, but you can instill in them and, just drop little things of encouragement and, like, hey, how's this going? Hey, how's your kid? Anything I can do for you, and like love on them and show them like life's not over. You can redeem yourself and redeem your life.
You know who you remind me of? Well, you don't know, but you remind me of Drew Crow in that, like, you don't just know boilers, you actually know the workforce. You should be on a lot of other podcasts where you talk about the workforce, because people don't understand their workforce, and that is a huge problem. And yeah, every single workforce is the same. Like, if they don't believe in themselves, and a lot of people don't, and it's not even their fault. And it's amazing that you're saying that we could, as employers, take on basically parenting some of these people into better lives. We tell them what to do. They're going to do it themselves. But like, you could change people's lives by just telling them or showing them that other people did it. That's part of why we love Automation Ladies, is we wanted to show that, people with any background, if they don't stop and they don't let everybody else tell them no, because they're going to tell you no anyway. They're like, you can't do that. Your family will tell you you can't do that. Like, all kinds of people will tell you you can't do something. And if you don't give up and you go get that thing, you go and you turn around and tell that story to people. It inspires people to do something. They're like, well, they did it. They see it. There's proof that other people that look like me or make as much money or not as much money as me could go to school, figure something out, take a training, start talking to people on the internet. That's what we're trying to do, is teach people to not give up, because yeah, a lot of us did already come from pretty much desperation. A lot of us have seen like the bottom, and a lot of us were really, like you said, we had opportunities that other people didn't have. And we're just, for some reason, able to see that and able to turn around and tell people like, hey, it's not your fault that you didn't have anything. It's not your fault that your parents didn't raise you to manage money. It's not your fault that like your parents weren't even hugging you. Like, there's all kinds of things that aren't your fault, but you could have a better life and it's not over. And even if you're 34 or 44 or 54, I'm 37. Like, I've never owned a home, but I don't feel like, I don't know, I'll own a home eventually. But yeah, I think there's just, the human aspect is really cool.
I'm gonna bring this up and brag on Allie a little bit. She's helped at least one of her employees buy a house. and you were aware of that, and you guys were aware of that was a goal, and like supported that employee in getting that done. So I think that's huge, because so many people don't know what ways there are to home ownership, because there's many.
First
There's a lot of
FHA,
different,
right? And then my employee is a veteran, so like there's veterans loans.
Yeah, so VA entitlement, of course. Surprisingly, a lot of people don't know how they actually work, and the fact that it's a dollar amount, not a number of houses, or also the fact that FHA is not.
We should talk about that in an episode.
It's just that you can only carry one FHA at a time. I know so much about this that I just forget that people don't know. And the other thing is like, oh, let's say you buy a house and then you want to take a job in a different city, or you need, your income stops or gets low or something, right? You can rent out that house and not, have to sell it, right? As long as it's, a somewhat decent investment, or of course it depends on the situation, but like there's just so many options for people that I think a lot of times, like the front line of an industry, like, and we'll get another episode about real estate agents and realtors and all that kind of stuff, but somebody that goes through the basic training, like to get your exam, they know the bread and butter, what the contract is, what the terms are, how to go look at a house, right? They know those sorts of things, but they really don't know anything outside of the very basics. And they need to choose to become educated in lots of different areas if they want to really be a great resource, both to their client or to their seller or whoever. But I've heard, I don't know on how many occasions I've heard somebody tell me, or a real estate agent tell me, oh, you can't do that, or that's not how it works. When I know very well that you can, in fact, do that. And that is exactly how it works, but maybe not in most situations, right? And I think, it's very common for people that know the bare minimums of any kind of profession or whatever to kind of think that they know all of it based on that, and then be like very quick to say, no, you can't do that.
Get second opinions, people, because a lot of people say things, and I've done it before, and I started figuring out that some people confidently say things that they don't know. So be careful. And that's technicians, engineers, older people, younger people, men, women. Like, you could accidentally shut something down for someone else's life because you just said that so fast and it wasn't like all of the considerations. And it's like, if you let yourself be that person who just, because I've done it before. I think the job before my last W-2 job, before I went out on my own, they said, we can't do that. And I just said, I guess it's over. And my dad was like, well, why don't you just counter? And I was like, can I do that? And he's like, well, if you can't, like, they'll say no. And I'm like, okay. So I countered and they're like, okay. And I'm like, holy shit, I almost walked away. And a lot of people don't ever counter. So I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that don't take the first no as the truth. Like, make sure it's really a no. Just get a second opinion. Like, if someone says you have cancer, make sure you really have that cancer. Don't necessarily take that first no.
That speaks a little bit. That also speaks a little bit to the broader point that you made, that like, even though what you learned in college isn't exactly what you ended up using, knowing that was really helpful in your job, right? And I think, again, when you stick to the very basics, the only things you had to learn, right, your bare minimum, you're not going to be able to troubleshoot or confidently know whether there's a path forward to something or not. But the more you learn about other things that are adjacent to what you do, even if they're not that exact thing, you become a much more powerful problem solver, right? Because then you can also know who you should talk to get something done, rather than just
you can speak to your customer more intelligently, or the other people that are there will be like, oh, this guy knows, or this girl knows the different, more than just one thing. And so I'm willing to talk to them because they're not an idiot. Some people will open up because they're like, they know that you are speaking their language versus just speaking just the technical stuff about just your thing. When you start explaining to them that you understand their thing in the grand scheme, or maybe just the company itself, like, that gives comfort to the managers, to the operators in you. And I try so bad to sell the glory of technicians, because the people are like, I'm here to, a technician job is a high glory job because you fix the thing. If you actually know how to fix the thing, that is one of the most incredible feelings, because I fixed many things in my life, and it happened after people were struggling for days trying to look at it. Like, different kinds of people were looking at it. Engineers, electricians, operators are looking at it. And I come and find a blown fuse and they're like, damn it. Or just like I find things, right, that people just didn't see. And like, it doesn't take me that long, but that glory of solving that for them and getting them going again is like huge. And I think that is just worth it by itself, is just like knowing that like people call your name because they know you have a reputation that you fix it, and they've already seen you fix it before. So they don't even waste time. They're like, get Eric over here right now. But yeah, like that glory is amazing. And I think that that is something that makes the technician job worth it, because people know your name. You know that you're just going to fix it. And the other thing about me is I can fight with electricians. Some programmers just end it there. They're like, they can't speak on the circuit. And so if you can't speak on a motor control circuit to an electrician, he can say or she can say all day long that it's a programming problem. But if I can't prove it's not me and it is them, then they can just basically say it isn't me and I have to prove it. So there is a huge value in knowing other people's stuff and being able to argue with them about it, because you can come up against other tradespeople. And if you do not speak their language, then they're going to stop you in your tracks and not let you do something. And if you can't argue with them intelligently, then you're stuck and you're just like not going to be able to solve the thing. So it's actually incredible to know more than just your thing.
So I want to tie this back to Eric's training content. Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like today in terms of the type of content you have, and then maybe what you're building? And does that have a module that says, if you don't know how to use a tape measure, like, here's how to show you that, or like those things that are not the core of your training focus, but the peripheral things that people are going to need to know?
So since I just started probably a year and a half ago, I've been very focused on boiler related stuff that gets somebody from zero to knows something. And a lot of the like, how to read a tape measure and whatnot, there are so many general courses and general, construction courses that have that in the big picture, I go, how can I most effectively make a impact as fast as possible? And that's what going back to the, outside resources are great, but they're not the end solution. It's how can I be a cog in the wheel and not try to be the wheel of everything? And I think so many employers and whatnot want to see a wheel of everything. They'll get sold a training program of, hey, this will teach them absolutely everything they need to know. And that's probably not going to be a great training program. So right now I'm very focused on specific topics. So like Honeywell mod motors are a very common stepper motor in the industry. They're on a lot of burners, a lot of feed water valves, and it's a very simple motor once you understand how it works. But part of my experience and building this company is I've struggled myself with Honeywell mod motors and trying to troubleshoot them and not have a step-by-step process. And that's one of the few manuals that is terrible. And it doesn't tell you like, is it this or is it this? And so then you end up learning from other people, and it becomes this like phone, chain of stuff where you start learning knowledge and you're like, well, is that true or is it not? But it's not written down. You can't read it in the manual. So it's very difficult for somebody who's starting to look towards a resource. And I want this course to be, hey, this is everything I know about it, and I was able to figure them all out. This is everything you should know about it. Also, I haven't released it yet, but have a burner linkage trainer course. And so burner linkage is one of the few things. So if you're not familiar with burners, a stepper motor will drive linkage on a linkage burner, and the linkage drives the air and fuel, which controls the firing rate of the burner. So if it's a full modulation burner, you have to open the air damper for more air and open a butterfly valve for more gas. And it deals with like angles and travel and arcs, which is very easy once you learn it. But it is like, I can remember looking at a very small burner, probably 1.5 million input, and I had just put it all together and it was making tons of CO, and I'm staring at it. I have my combustion analyzer and I know it's wrong. And this was probably year 2 of me working. I knew what to do, but the linkage was so messed up on the burner that I was like, man. So luckily I worked for an amazing company, had amazing people. So another person came out and just showed me like, hey, like this is what we're going to do. Oh, we need to do this. We got to increase the speed of the air here and do this. And they got it all fixed up. And so many people don't have that. One, because a lot of those people are retiring out of the industry, or two, they just work in a general HVAC company and then they just get anointed the burner person and they don't have another person to call. And who do you go for that resource? And there are how to adjust linkage in a manual, or there's YouTube videos, but as an employer, it's how do we pick and designate one resource that we know is reliable and then consistently use that resource. And if you have to constantly go and say, hey, look up this YouTube video and then this one and look at this manual, it's all the information is scattered everywhere. And like I said, I'm not really making any new information. The value of my company is putting that information in a linear format where the managers and the employers don't have to think about what am I giving this person, or is this information good? It's, hey, we know this is good. This is a solid resource and we can give it to you reliably over and over again. And then on top of that, I actually built a burner linkage trainer, which will teach you Honeywell mod motors, burner linkage, and gas butterfly valves. And, a lot of people have had comments, DMs like, oh, the trainer's expensive, like it's custom machine stuff. But I can remember and I can think back to when I was learning linkage, like there's so much mystery to it. And you're training on a customer's job site with an older service technician, but you're still there billing out hours. So you feel like you can't make a mistake. And in front of a live boiler, when you're not comfortable around them, you put up so many mental roadblocks that you're not comfortable, and all learning stops and it becomes a survival situation. And it's essentially, how do I get this linkage adjusted to the point where the CR on my analyzer and my O2 look good, and I got to get out here. And getting people out of that frame and mindset is the only way that they're going to learn. And, a lot of older people have been like, oh, I just figured it out on the job, so you have to. And yes, like there is an aspect to that, but also at the same time, what can we do and innovate in the industry to help people learn stuff without having to go through all the hardships of the people before them? And that's where this trainer came from. So essentially, the trainer gives you an in-house ability as a company to train people on linkage, and they can make all the mistakes they want because there's not a flame connected to the linkage. There's just precision. It's machined and laser engraved angle markings that give you feedback. So you can walk through and be like, all right, my stepper motor made this much direction change in this way, and then my gas valve made this direction change, and my air damper, made this change. And having that feedback is very valuable. I have a lot of people say, oh, well, we have an old burner that we pull off a boiler in our shop. And I'm like, that's absolutely great. But there's no feedback to a air damper that has no way to measure it. You're just kind of measuring spatial position based on what you see. But when you make a linkage change, sometimes you're only changing the air damper by 4 degrees. And it's very hard to look at blades of an air damper and go, oh yeah, that changed by 4 degrees, and it impacts the learning. Whereas the boiler and burner linkage trainer, he outputs numbers. So I've made like lessons like, hey, if your air damper is this, what do you have to do to make it open farther? And knowing how to do that eventually clicks. It's like seeing the Matrix. And I could walk up after I learned it. It was probably year 3 or so I learned it. Like I was so scared. Like parallel positioning, which is like independent motors on burners, I could do that all day. But linkage, I was so scared every time I walked into a boiler room and saw that and just hoped it was right. But after I learned it, it's like, oh, this isn't right. Rip all the linkage arms off, rip all this off, and then reset everything, and let's get this right. And I think a lot of employers discount that step and just say like, oh, just get out in the field and learn it. And you're essentially ignoring all the hazards that I've talked about of you got a live burner that's running, so they're worried about that. They're worried about the heat, the noise. Most mechanical rooms aren't lit properly, and it's just not a good training environment. And even with a senior service technician there showing them, and if you're at a customer site and at the end of the day that senior service tech wants to go home, and a lot of senior service techs, like, they mean well and they'll, like, train people or whatnot, but it's not repeatable. Like, if you send the same person, even with the same person, if you send them out with 10 different people, they're going to get 10 different experiences back. And that's not scalable, especially when they retire. So how do we get scalable experiences and have new people learn stuff the same over and over again, so that if I hire 10 people in my company, ideally they get the same training? Now, your outcomes are going to be different, and that's based on how they are as a person. But since you have an internal training program, you can recognize and measure that. And if they aren't achieving what they need to, you can always loop back and go, hey, where did we stop? Where are you struggling with? And plug them back into the program. Where if you're sending them off to an offsite training, or if you're just doing on the job training with somebody else, it's just like, oh, did you learn this at the end of the day? Yes, no. If no, there's no visibility of why they didn't learn it or what they're struggling with. I think a lot of frustration of newer people is they're probably at 80 or 90% of understanding it, but it's the, don't stop digging, don't give up, you're almost to the gold. And people, stop at 80, 90% of understanding, but they feel like they have no understanding, and they just need that extra 10 or 20%, and then it'll click, and then they'll be like, what, how did I not know this? And, I always take it back to like mathematics of, I can remember sitting in high school geometry class, and you sit there and the teacher's like, hey, we're going to learn this new concept. They're doing it on the board. You're like, yeah, that makes sense. This is easy and whatnot. And then they draw another problem on the board, and then they call on you. And then you get up there and you're like, holy moly, I don't know how to do anything. Like, I didn't even know the first step. And because you were passively learning, and then once you're actively learning, it's, hey, I don't even know where to start. And then the teacher can guide you through that. And that's what this burner linkage trainer or any training course that I'm trying to build is. It gives employers an active approach to training their people, and it makes their people also responsible for the training, because you can track it and whatnot. So like, hey, did you do this or did you not? Whereas a YouTube video, you can't really, unless you plug it into a system like an LMS or whatever, you can't really track that somebody watched a YouTube video. And a lot of YouTube videos, while they may be presenting great information, they're not presenting in a way for a learning format.
Yeah. So do you put your content out on YouTube or any shorts or things like that? Or are you primarily, on your website that you have some of the video courses that people can buy, as well as documentation type, like checklists and stuff? And some of the price points are definitely at a point where, a technician, somebody that has the initiative could even, take a look at this themselves. But you're primarily basically targeting this to the employers being able to offer it to their technicians and have it be part of a larger program.
Well, so funny you bring that up, because, that was my initial offering or thought of, I can make a LMS system, learning management system, and I can have employers put their people into the system and they can track it. And I found that I was dealing with a lot of managers that really didn't care about the outcome of their technicians. It ends up being like you waste a ton of time with people who don't really care about the outcome. And after talking to a lot of people and whatnot, I decided to kind of pivot and deal directly with technicians. And that's actually what you're seeing. That website's like 4 days old at this point. But it
looks really good.
It is like, hey, you're the one that is actually going to benefit from this. And if somebody is willing to sign up for a course online, even if their employer is backing them up and reimbursing them, if they're willing to sign up for that course, they probably have the initiative to be a great service technician, and they just need the guidance. And that's what I'm now pivoting towards, because I was wasting so much time emailing, calling managers. And, on my end also, like, I don't have the 4-year magic course that they want of like yeah, buy this and
everything you need to know and
so
all in one
it's
place,
also
right? Yeah.
like, I would have people sign up and like they would never even log in. And so I've only talked to the managers. So then they signed 3 people up. And then, I feel bad. Like they've given me money. I want feedback. Like, are you guys learning anything? And then, you talk to the manager and they're like, oh, we're just so busy right now. We don't have time for that. And it's just like, I want to help them. And at this other aspect, it's like, that's their decision. But at the end of the day, like that is not going to be my core customer if they're going to constantly say, hey, we're too busy for this, because of just how mechanical trades are, is you're always going to be busy unless you're like a residential
Yep.
HVAC, which is, you'll have the mid seasons of fall and maybe spring where people really don't need heating or cooling. But in commercial industrial, especially if you're doing process stuff, there's always demand for
Yeah.
stuff and people are always busy. And since most employers are understaffed, it is running their current staff to the wall 100%. And a lot of them are just trying to fight through their week, fight the fires, and then go home. And there's no thought of, hey, we just need to train our workforce now. I mean, I see it on LinkedIn. There's so many employers that post, hey, we want a senior service technician. And, we're a dynamic family, something, all the buzzwords. I'm like, where do you think these senior
Yeah.
service technicians are hanging out? If they're unemployed, there's probably a reason there's unemployed. And most senior service technicians are in a groove where they love the company where they're at, and money doesn't mean too much for them. And that's a huge jump, even if they are getting paid more money. And this goes back to company culture of like, you're taking a risk on that new company. And especially if you go to a company that's
Yep.
desperate and they just expect that senior service technician to just work way more and then do a bunch of on-call or a bunch of travel, where the company they were at, maybe they're getting paid $5 less, but they're not traveling, they're not working weekends, they're not working nights, and they love it. And that's another topic of just the culture aspect of it. But tying this back into training, I'm now going after the people who are directly learning, and is planning to hold live classes over the internet that is integrated also
Nice.
with these classes. So essentially, you can take an online class, have a live class, and then go back and forth. And through that, a lot of people, there's a big misconception in the industry of, I'm a service technician, I can only learn hands on. And there's
Yeah.
nobody more than me that learns hands on. Like I love to feel things and pick up a wrench and turn bolts and whatnot. But at the start of everything, you need to learn like the fundamentals, because a lot of problems in the industry or in any industry, something's not broken, but something may not be operating correctly. And this can come a lot of times with new equipment startups. So you have a new building, all new equipment, and I have yet to start up a boiler system where you just flip the switch and everything's great. And so, like
Everything worked
maybe the
perfectly.
balancer
Yeah.
didn't balance the building correctly, or the pumps are wrong, or the strainers are full of something from new construction. There's always something to do. And, you don't walk in the room and, oh, this is broken in half. Let me fix this and throw a new part on and then leave. It takes a higher understanding. And if you're not solid on the fundamentals of what is the sequence of operations of a burner and, of a boiler, and how does steam actually move? Steam is pressure and the steam carries heat. And, how does water move? How do you heat water? Why do you need so many GPM to go through a boiler and all that stuff? Like, you can't see it, but you have to understand the fundamentals. And that builds you up to a service technician that you reach a second tier of understanding, where you can walk into mechanical rooms and, see process systems, and there's not something that's broken, but at the end of the line, the widgets aren't coming out correctly, and hey, we don't have the proper heat or whatnot. And it's not, a part you can fix. Maybe it's a setting, combustion's off or something, but you have to look at it at a deeper level rather than just being like, oh, I'm just hands on, I just go in there and just fix it and then I'll leave.
Yeah, and I think also when you do get that hands-on, it's really helpful to be a bit familiar with what you're getting your hands on, making that same point in another context. So I think that, video content, more bite-sized content rather than, hose it all down in the period of uh, 2 days or a week. I just remember once one of my jobs that hired, and they didn't really have an internal training program. So my first job out of college, they trained a lot. Like, they are set up to train people in the industry out of college. And so, they have a really long training period, and then on to job training and things like that. And then second place I went, they hire almost exclusively, or they did anyway at the time, this was a while back, from their competitors, people that already had the experience. And then I was coming from a slightly different technology, going from machine vision into pneumatics, and I didn't know anything about pneumatics. And I was very candid about that in my interview. I said, I don't know anything about pneumatics and how they work, but I'm a quick learner. This is really interesting. I know some of the stuff. I've seen them around on the line a lot. When I kick out a bad part from the vision system, or I say it needs to be kicked out, something has to kick it out. Oftentimes that's an air cylinder or something like that. But it was a very different cultural approach, like a company that's set up to train people versus a company that expects people to already know everything when they come in. And my manager said, why aren't you going out to see customers yet? And I said, well, I'll go when I have something of value to add. Like, I'm not just going to show up with nothing. And I ended up kind of having to, that manager wasn't a manager for very long. And maybe that was pretty easy to tell why. My next manager ended up getting me a lot of training with applications engineers, but it had to be sort of, ad hoc put together. Because the first training I did get sent on was a week-long training that was meant for distributors that pretty much already know most of the industry, and they're maybe going from selling one brand to another, or they're picking up this line. And it was an entire week's worth of just class after class after class after class in a basement room with no windows, no light, 9 to 5. And I think it's the longest training I've ever sat through, and also the training that I retained the least amount of information. Because it wasn't at my level. It assumed I knew a bunch of stuff that I didn't. And then it was just crammed way too much into a short period of time. And I also had work to do. I had customers, asking me for things. And so my attention was scattered. And I can only imagine that getting that same training, but even if it was the same training, it probably would have been more effective if I had been able to space it out a bit and then follow up with each one of, hey, these are all the things I didn't understand in this module before having to sit through the next one. So I absolutely think it's fantastic that you're taking this area of the industry that doesn't seem to have any, training in this manner, make the leap to go out on your own and make it. Huge props to that. Excuse me, my dog just came in and decided to yawn really loudly. She's like, time's up. Okay. So I think that this is an amazing initiative that you're doing. We at Automation Ladies, we've had a lot of dreams too for things that we feel like, or we've seen that there's gaps in trainings. Allie's actually coming up with, or she already came up with the curriculum, but a masterclass for designing and building panels, the way that she learned to do it from a non-electrical engineer standpoint, maybe, because she has a chemical engineering degree, but then, ran a panel shop. And I think, there's a lot of different ways to teach the same thing. And there's also a lot of different ways to learn the same thing. So not everybody's going to learn in the same way. Some people are really going to gravitate to the way that you're teaching and the format that you have it. I will give a plug for your website before you get a chance to, boilearn.com, a brand new website that looks amazing. It has a couple of classes on there, a couple of other things. Is there anything you want to tell us that we should be looking forward to that should be coming up on the website soon if people want to go check it out or bookmark it for themselves?
So like I said earlier, coming out with a digital burner linkage class, how to adjust linkage. And if you are interested, it's at a company level. If you are interested in buying a burner linkage trainer, I also have, I think 2 available. It is a bigger cost investment, but it makes perfect sense. And your payback is, depending on your numbers, training 7 to 8 people on burner linkage and motors instead of sending them off to different classes or on the job training, which has different areas of effectiveness. I will say I don't claim to be the end all be all. And if you are an employer or a manager, your path to a trained workforce is finding the resources that work for you. And while I'm building resources, there are other companies in the boiler industry that also have resources that are amazing and great. And I always tell people, like, I don't really have competition because there's so much need and there's no one size fits all approach. And one person may learn from my videos and whatnot, and another person may learn by taking home apart at night and just taking it apart and doing whatever. And as an employer or manager, you need to recognize that and not just go like, oh, go to this class. And if you didn't learn, all right, well, you just give up. And so I just try to position myself as an option for the industry and an option for employers. And especially now that I've turned toward an option for service technicians to turn to. They're not going to learn everything from me. I'm not an engineer. I've only been in the industry now, 8 or 9 years, but I have enough knowledge that I know I can put it together and teach people about it. You don't have to be in the industry 30, 40 years to essentially teach people.
No, you don't. Yeah, and I think a lot of people shy away from putting together any content or teaching because they feel like they're not an expert. And I like to say there's always somebody that's a couple steps behind you that could really learn from what you've learned. And sometimes it's easier to learn from someone that's not too far ahead of you versus someone that knows everything, because then they forget some of the basics that you kind of, they assume that you know things that you don't. But when somebody that you're learning from is a little closer to your level, you're much more likely to remember what it was like back when you were in their shoes and be able to have more actionable learning that is closer to where you're at. And not to say that learning from industry veterans isn't as valuable or even more valuable, but I just want to encourage people not to hold themselves up to some sort of perfection standard or that you have to be some sort of expert. As I've now gotten to know some of the more veteran like experts or people that are training in the automation industry, for instance, I realized that even they don't consider themselves experts of everything. And usually the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know, and you become more humble about what you know. And I find that usually a lot of times the best teachers too, they don't claim to know it all. It's kind of dangerous when somebody thinks that they know it all, because then they're not open to new information or changing their mind or understanding that there are always limitations to what any one person can know, or even just understanding something from a different perspective. So yeah, I kind of threw out our last question, but I made it specific to your website. So now if people are interested in learning more about becoming a boiler technician, or our audience is more so, typically automation techs or mechatronics technicians, or people that work in, manufacturing facilities, do you have any resources or things that you want to throw out to people that they should be aware of, or just where they can follow you if they want to become more boiler adjacent and maybe learn some from your content along the way, even if they're not candidates exactly to be purchasing or going through your training?
So I would always recommend LinkedIn. I started on LinkedIn seriously probably a year and a half ago, and I recognized that I got to put myself out there beyond just cold calling and emailing. And LinkedIn has been such a valuable resource for me. And that's how I met Allie. And just there's so many people that see LinkedIn as, oh, this is how I get my next job, or that's for the C-suite to be on. And there's less people on there that are just maybe a service technician or a lower level because they don't see any value from it. But there's so much that I learned from LinkedIn, and so many people that I've met on LinkedIn that I now see at like trade shows and whatnot, that they like, we met virtually and whatnot, and, comment back and forth, me DM and call. But now I see them at a trade show, and it's just opened up another level. Whereas like Facebook, like you can't really search, like you only search by like people's names, or like Instagram is another good one. But LinkedIn, like you can search and just find people from boiler companies and people in your industry. And like most of my following and people are just boiler related people. And I learned so much from people, and like, hey, this is something cool I did. And LinkedIn has become a platform that is greater than, oh, I'm just looking for a job, or I'm just trying to share leadership techniques or whatnot. And especially if you have a niche like boilers or automation, it is so easy to talk about it, and because there's thousands of people out there that love the industry and love their job just like you. And I would just encourage people, get on LinkedIn. Like, LinkedIn has changed my life by posting consistently on it and being active, of just the people that I've met, the business that I get from it. And I would also comment real quick on your comment about being the expert. I always tell people, to be the expert, you just have to know one thing more than the next person. And at a customer level, I talked about earlier, at about year 4, I hit a level of, I understood most things. And it's not that I knew everything, I just understood how to fix problems. And being a service technician and going out to a factory, work on automation or boilers or whatever you do, it's not about memorizing everything. With how much information and digital controllers, and each manufacturer's coming out with their own thing, there's no way for you to keep up with it, even if we were to stop innovating and you were to learn everything in the industry. But there's so much innovation going on, you're never going to keep up. So it's understanding the fundamentals, but then it's also understanding the resources that you can put together to solve the problem. Because a customer is not paying for you to know how to solve the problem. Your customer is paying for you to fix the problem. And as long as you can fix the problem, it doesn't really matter how you get there. So for me, it was a combination of knowing the fundamentals, just zooming out on the problem a little bit, and then having a process in my mind of like, hey, this is how we do it. And then also referencing the manuals and manufacturers' resources. Manufacturers spend so much time on manuals and resources on their websites that people just never even access and give up. And there's so many service calls that I went to where I just opened up the manual, I looked at the manual diagram, and then I looked at the problem. I'm like, well, I don't know, I've never seen this before, but the manual diagram says this and the problem is not this. So then you change it to the manual diagram and everything works magically. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And people are like, well, how'd you know that? I'm like, well, I didn't know it. I just opened up the manual and I read the page about this part. I didn't read the whole manual. I don't memorize the manual. I just understood the information enough to fix the problem. The customer's happy. I'm happy. I didn't understand their entire system. I didn't, it's not about understanding everything. It's how do we fix the problem in the most efficient way? But that compounds over time. And with 20 years experience, 30 years experience, you go through enough problems that don't have to reference the manuals or whatnot as much. And you've seen stuff from experiences before. So then you get faster at solving things. But if you're starting out, don't put too much effort or into solving things fast. It's about solving things correctly, because the callback or the lost money from something not working is always way more than the hour or 2 extra of you making sure you're fixing something correctly.
Yeah, great tips. Thank you so much for spending time with us today, Eric. I know Allie had all kinds of boiler questions that she probably didn't get to, but she had to drop off, unfortunately. We're also in the middle of a very busy day. I was telling her before we got on recording that I feel her pain now. I am not used to this, but to be in the middle of like a very large spreadsheet that you're working on and then have to take a break to go record a podcast. I love the podcasts and they're great, but it's a different type of feeling to like rip me away from my spreadsheet that I was all the way into. So I know she had to jump back to another meeting, but I'm really glad we were able to get this on the books. Thank you so much for coming on our show. And we feel very honored that it's your very first podcast. And I'm sure we would love to have you back for an update, maybe in, a year or two, whenever. We'll stay in touch on LinkedIn as you get your program larger and you get more, people through it and you get some more feedback. I'm really excited to see where it goes for you. And you have a couple of big time supporters over here in the Automation Ladies. So thanks everybody for listening. If you haven't yet, we do have, if you haven't subscribed to this, you're listening to your first episode of Automation Ladies, maybe because you're part of Eric's audience. If conversations around automation are of interest to you that are like partially technical, but mostly people, we really care about hearing people's stories, giving people a wider look into the industry and the types of people, the types of jobs, the types of, things that are going on out there. We talk about all kinds of stuff. We mainly have conversations that we want to have because we're a couple. I should say 3 now. 3 very curious, very hardworking ladies in the automation industry. And we've always been the type that take our work home or, watch the training videos on the weekends or whatever. So we're going to continue to have these conversations, and we'll keep pulling in more fun and interesting, disciplines that are related to automation, but maybe not quite automation. And if you like lots of rambling, like me, asking compound questions and saying too many things all at once in run-on sentences, then please do subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, probably Apple Podcast or something like that. Or if you're on our website, if you're not on the website, it's automationladies.io. But we also have a YouTube channel. And currently the YouTube channel only streams our live streams. So you have unedited content on there, live demos, live interviews that we've done. But hopefully with a timely introduction from Eric's friend of a friend, somebody that can edit video, or some other resource that we put in place. So we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button, as people say. Those of us that create content, and maybe Eric, you can chime in on this, it's not always rosy. It can be daunting and it can be kind of exhausting, especially if you feel like nobody's actually watching or listening, or doesn't care, which we thankfully have a very nice little community, mostly on LinkedIn, that we know listens and we know that they care. And so that really helps us. But it would also be great to, get to see that people are actually picking this up and wanting to see it next time. So I'll give a little plug for ourselves, automationladies.io. And you can pretty much search for us on any of the podcast platforms and or YouTube as Automation Ladies. And we would also love any of your reviews or comments. There is actually a function on our website where you can leave us a voicemail. So if you have anything to say, good or bad, please let us know. My only ask for, constructive feedback is please be kind. And take that into the rest of your week. I hope that you can be kind to yourself and be kind to others that you work with. Try to lift people up. Try to make them aware of the possibilities for themselves if they don't know. Go out there and be a good coworker, friend, person in the world, because there's always something that we could be doing better. And, helping others makes us feel good. At least it does for me. So with that said, thank you very much for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.